forget about the pandemic and pretend that you were just having a normal life. um, that's not always easy to do, but hopefully you found it. Um, for those of you who are here in Iowa, it was actually kind of nice this weekend. We had a lot of snow and did some sledding and some snowshoeing. At least I did. It was nice, kind of pretty out there. But now we're back to reality, right? So a lot of this week is really about the paper, right? So my plan for this week is, in general, we're going to meet fewer afternoons this week. In fact, I'm not planning on meeting this afternoon. We'll not meet tomorrow afternoon, and we'll not meet Wednesday afternoon. Uh, um, so this is really to kind of give you extra time, both to write and then to read. So this afternoon and tomorrow afternoon is really kind of writing time to be working on your paper. And then Wednesday afternoon is really reading time because we're going to do peer reviews. Okay. And so just to kind of give you all a heads up so that we're all on the same page, you really have to have that first draft done by Wednesday at noon. Okay. By Wednesday at noon. And then we'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow, but you're going to send your peer review, your first draft, to one other person who will then read it, give you some comments, all right? And I'm going to have a peer review worksheet for you all to fill out, both as a writer, kind of ask what kind of questions you think you would most like your reviewer to take a look at. And then as a reviewer, you're going to try to talk about those comments. And so that's kind of what we're going to do on Wednesday afternoon. And then Thursday afternoon, we will have time to meet writers with people who do their peer review. Okay, so anyway, that's how we're going to work. So does that kind of make sense? Right, it kind of makes sense. And so in terms of like picking peer reviews, I'm just going to try to think about who's a good match, but we're going to just switch one-on-one, right? So, for instance, if I match up, Hao Zhang and Max, Hao Zhang will read Max's paper, Max will read Hao Zhang's paper, right? That's kind of how we'll do it. And so we'll set aside some time Thursday afternoon so that you can all kind of meet. You can talk about issues that you have in your paper. You can talk through the written commentary that you give, and anything else. So anyway, it's you probably have been through the peer review process in other classes. This, because we have a smaller group and because it's longer papers, we're just going to have one other person read it. But I think it'll be pretty straightforward, right? I think it'll be pretty straightforward. But as always, make sure that you ask some questions if you have some questions as we go along. I'll actually send you this afternoon the peer review worksheet so that as a writer, you could begin filling out the questions that you would most like to have your reviewer think about, and then just also to get you thinking about the process, right? To get you thinking about the process. So is that all clear? All clear for everyone? Anybody have any questions about the paper? Nothing? Okay, all right, well, onward and upward. This afternoon, I have a couple of little meetings, but I'm basically going to be around. So if there's some of you that have some questions, or you'd like to talk to me individually about your paper, send me an email. We can set up a time to meet, okay? And that's going to be true for tomorrow too. So, I have a couple little things going on, but in general, the time is basically open. So if you want to talk and get some feedback, or there's something that you're struggling with, or you just have a question and you would like to talk with me one-on-one, this afternoon, tomorrow afternoon would be really good times to do that, okay? Okay, well, what are we going to talk about today? So as I said, really today's material, or this whole week, is going to be maybe kind of going back and talking about topics that we've kind of brushed upon, but didn't really spend a lot of time talking about. And so, this kind of going back and thinking a little bit more in depth and detail about some topics related to growth that we often kind of ran through. And so today we're going to talk about population growth, right? I'm going to talk a little bit about Malthus, We're going to talk a little bit about what demographers call the population transition, right, or the demographic transition. And we'll kind of think about how this all relates to why some countries are rich and some countries are poor. So, as I said, this is a topic that we've talked about some already in this class, but I think it merits a little bit more in-depth discussion, right? In-depth discussion. So, population growth and economic growth. So when I think about this question, I always think about something that I've observed, um, having lived in less developed countries for a period of time and kind of traveled extensively in poor parts of the world. I've noticed this unusual thing that the poorer the country is, the more that you see people getting paid to stand around and not do very much. So I think about like living in Botswana, for instance, and I had a coffee shop that I went to because they had pretty reliable internet and they had air conditioning, two things that were at an absolute premium while I was there. And so, I'd go to the coffee shop, and one of the things I noticed is that you'd have a coffee shop with 5 or 6 patrons in there and about 10 or 12 people working, right? Kind of standing around looking at each other. And this is one of the things that I've kind of noticed time and time again. Poor countries tend to have more people paid to stand around and not do very much. And it gives you this sense, right? A sense that you have when you travel to particular countries. I have to say, I got this sense the most traveling to India, but this sense that, well, these countries are poor because they simply have too many people. There's just simply too many people here, right? That having too many people makes you poor. And so I want to talk about that a little bit, right? That kind of idea, does having too many people make you poor? Related to this is an idea that often comes up when you're talking about population growth, which is capital a complement or a substitute to labor? In other words, when we get more capital, does that replace labor or does that make labor more productive? And what I'm going to argue is that when we think about countries caught in a poverty trap, one of the defining features of a poverty trap is that capital is a substitute for labor, right? And one of the things that makes rich countries rich is that capital becomes a complement to labor, right? And so we'll kind of talk about how that occurs. But when you have institutions set up so that capital replaces labor, is a substitute for labor, you are very likely going to have a very poor country, right? And one of the things about having productive institutions is having incentives so that capital is a complement, not just a substitute to labor, right? And so we'll kind of talk about this more as we go along. Whenever you talk about population, though, and economic growth, you got to talk about Malthus, right? So Thomas Malthus was a Presbyterian minister in England in the mid 1600s. And he was in many ways kind of the father of modern demographics, right? And so one of the things that Malthus did as he kind of traveled around for his work was he actually got interested in what was happening to the population of Britain. And so he actually went to these local registers where people would register births and names. And so he began to kind of calculate what was happening. And so what he observed was that there was population growth. And it was exponential, right? Meaning that babies have babies. He also observed that there was a big, what we could call fixed factor in production: land. That land was a very important factor in production, but it was fixed. So, what's going to happen to this ratio of capital to labor when capital is mainly land? Capital to labor was going to fall as the population grew exponentially. This is essentially diminishing marginal returns, right? If we keep on adding more and more labor to a fixed amount of land, we are going to experience significant diminishing marginal returns. And so the result of this is that the entire population would live at subsistence levels of income. Because basically, anytime that you have higher income levels, all that's going to do is incentivize more population growth. And what's more population growth going to do? That's going to drive down income levels on a per capita basis. So you are stuck in this Malthusian trap, right? This is essentially the Malthusian trap. So this idea that Malthus has about people being stuck in Malthusian traps, about this idea that population growth means that people are going to be trapped at subsistence levels of income. This is such an important idea in the development of thought across many different disciplines throughout the 1800s and 1900s. So for instance, Charles Darwin read Malthus and he said, yeah, that's right, that's nature. So how exactly does nature escape this Malthusian trap? And so Darwin said that reading Malthus got him thinking about the idea of competition and evolution. Right? And this idea of natural selection, that essentially evolution is a competition towards selecting traits that allow you to reproduce. And so Malthus was a big influence on Darwin in his thinking about evolution. Malthus was a big influence on Karl Marx, right? Without getting into all the details of Marxist economics, one of the fundamental concepts of Marxist economics is that as you have more workers, wages are going to fall. And so this idea that workers are trapped by competition with other workers, and also in competition with capital. That's another important part of Marxist theory, is that capital in some sense is competition for workers, not complements, but substitutes for workers. More recently, there's a book from 1970 that was very influential. in academic thinking for many years called the population bomb. And basically, Paul Ehrlich just made the argument that the world cannot support more than 2 billion people. And that once we got beyond the 2 billion people mark, we were looking at ecological collapse, economic collapse, right? And that this was essentially a bomb that would destroy our way of life, right? Ehrlich's number was at 2 billion, right? Now we are up above 7 billion, right? But this idea that there's a limit to the population that we can support economically or ecologically is a very, very influential one, right? A very, very influential one. It was also very highly evident in a lot of development policy from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Should say here. Right, so throughout the 50s to the 70s, development policy was highly influenced by kind of Malthusian or Marxist thinking here. The idea of sterilization. In India, more than 1 million people were sterilized without their knowing about it, right? These tended to be poor people of lower caste that were forcibly sterilized. A lot of emphasis on birth control policies that limit the number of births. For instance, the one-child policy in China. Where often people who had 2 children, the children were forcibly taken away from them. There were forced abortions. There were forced sterilizations, right? Those are just many of the horrible things that took place as a result of China's one-child policy. And then also kind of this capital-based development policy that we talked about. That you have to increase the capital to labor ratio, just like Malthus said. That's the only way you're going to get rich, is increase the amount of capital you have per person. So you can do that by reducing L, or you can do that by increasing K. Was Malthus right? Well, as we're going to talk about, listen, there is more than a seed of truth to some of the things that Malthus talks about. We're going to go back and examine this a little bit later. It's not the case that Malthus was completely wrong, but in general, the Malthusian economics has not withstood the data test, which is that in general, as our population has gotten bigger, we've gotten richer, right? In fact, contrary to Malthus, today, obesity is a bigger global health problem than famine, right? Obesity is killing more people than a lack of food, at least globally. And so, yeah, in general, what Malthus predicted has not come true, at least on a global level. That's not to say that locally, there are some areas of the world that look very Malthusian. But at least on a global basis, Malthus's predictions have kind of failed to hold. So why is that? Right? So let's think about this. And this is a book, or this is the approach that your book takes. They say, well, let's actually think about a model, a Malthusian model, right? That helps us kind of think about what Malthus was talking about in more detail. So let's think about a production function where there's a fixed factor. such as land, right? And what I mean by this is the amount of land is fixed, right? There's no way you can increase it. So that now our production function looks like this. Okay, so X here is kind of like capital, but with the recognition that you can't increase it. You can't increase it. The amount is fixed. Right, so I should really put X bar here, right? Meaning it's completely exogenous. What happens when you write this in per capita terms? Right? Divide each side by L. And we can rewrite it like this. Okay, what do we see here? Well, already we're beginning to see some pretty Malthusian results, right? What happens if there's an increase in labor? Per capita income is going to go down, right? So the more people you have, the lower your per capita income is going to be. So this is, we can kind of call this the first part of the Malthusian model. But there's a second part of the Malthusian model we need to pay attention to. The second part is that population growth goes up with income, right? So the other part of Malthus was that when income goes up, population growth will go up, right? As people eat more and they're healthier, they're going to have more babies. So in other words, we might model it like this, okay? So C here is a subsistence level of consumption, meaning the basic amount that you need to stay alive. And theta is just a parameter that tells us how much population growth responds to income growth. So think about what's going on here. If income is greater than C, then the population is growing. But what happens if income falls below C? The population is going to fall. Basically, this is famine, right? That's famine. If per capita income levels fall below subsistence levels of consumption, then we get famine and people are dying, negative population growth. Okay, everybody with me? So those are the two parts of Malthus. We have this fixed factor production, and we have this subsistence level of consumption, right? So here's our production function, right? Let's plug this in to this, okay, and rewrite. We can rewrite this equation that determines population growth as this. So that's population growth, right? We've just plugged the production function into our population growth. We can think about a steady state level of labor. What's the steady state for this function? Well, remember, the steady state is where growth rate goes to 0. So where is the growth rate of the population going to be 0? Set this whole thing equal to 0 and solve. And what do you get? I'm skipping the algebra here. It's really pretty simple. That's the steady state of labor. So if you think about what this is saying, this is pretty straightforward, right? This is pretty intuitive. What's going to drive up higher population? More X bar. In other words, more land means you can support a bigger population. Or lower subsistence levels of income. The less people eat, the more people you can sustain. Or higher productivity. But note, what's got to be true in the steady state? L dot L has got to equal to 0. If we go all the way back up here, when's L dot L going to be 0? When Y equals subsistence levels of consumption. In other words, in the steady state, what's going to be true? Everyone lives at subsistence. Right? Everyone lives at subsistence. What happens if Y is greater than C? Then population growth is positive, and if population growth is positive, then output will fall until you're back to subsistence, right? And if output is less than C, then people start starving. But the glass half full view of famine is when people starve, well, income goes up. Right? So there's a steady state in this model. And where is that steady state? Where everybody lives at subsistence. And there's no getting out of it. There's no getting out of it. This is the Malthusian trap. Everybody is stuck at living at subsistence levels of income. Okay, everyone is stuck at living at subsistence levels of income. And if you think that's depressing, there's something that's even more depressing here. Technology doesn't solve the problem. If you have an increase in A, right, for instance, let's say you develop this new technology, yes, that increases output, but only temporarily. Because what happens if output goes up above consumption? Then population goes up, right? Population growth goes up. Which drives output right back down to subsistence. So this Malthusian trap cannot be solved by technology. It can't be solved by technology. All the, in a weird way here, the only thing that more technology does is it just means you have more people. It's not changing standards of living. It just means you have more people to feed in the long run. In fact, strangely enough, it actually makes you more vulnerable to famine because you have that many more people for a fixed factor of production. Okay, so you can see why people who read Malthus, there was one reviewer who read Malthus's book and said, if this is economics, then economics is truly a dismal science. And that moniker, the dismal science, you might have heard this before, often referred to in economics. That's where this comes from, right? That this is a pretty depressing view of the future, that no matter what you do, we are trapped in subsistence levels of income, okay? And, you know, honestly, really, if you think about a lot of human history, you know, I think the Malthusian trap does describe a lot of what we observe in human history. Today and later in the week, we'll talk about the Black Plague during the Middle Ages. But one argument is that the Black Plague is actually one of the reasons why the Industrial Revolution began in England, because England suffered the worst from the Black Plague. And you might say, why in the world would the Black Plague be a good thing? Well, during the Black Plague, so many people died, right? Basically in England, 40% of the population died, which is bad, but the good thing was it actually dramatically increased per capita GDP, and it dramatically increased wages. And so some economic historians have said this was part of what incentivized the accumulation of new capital, new technology, and better institutions in England, was because labor was relatively scarce after the Black Plague, right? And so the scarcity of labor forced England, in ways we'll talk about here, to change the way that they organized themselves. And so, you know, kind of contrary to what seems to be decent human thinking, the Black Plague might have been a reason for England's success, not its failure. And we'll come back to that here in a minute. So yeah, Malthusian economics is a pretty depressing view of the future. So what happens if you move from Malthus to Roemer? Because we see something much, much different. Well, the key difference in Roemer is that there's a way to overcome the diminishing margin returns to labor. a way to overcome diminishing marginal returns is not just through a one-time increase in technology, but a consistently growing technology. And so you'll remember in Romer, we talked about a model with leaks and matches. Where what's true? Having more technology leads you to grow faster. So you can develop innovation by having more productivity, by spending more on research and development, or having more people leads to more leaks and matches. So let's think about how this changes the results from Malthus. Going back to Malthus, the result we talked about here in a minute ago, I wrote this equation up. Right? That this is our steady state level of labor. What happens if we write this in terms of growth rates? So in other words, we take logs and then we differentiate this with respect to time. What do we get? L dot L is equal to X dot X Okay, so putting this in growth rates, we get this. But these are exogenous, right? These don't change over time. C and X are fixed. They don't change. So if you plug in, you take the Malthus model, but now let's plug in the Romer assumption about A dot A, right? What do we get? So if we just combine Romer and Malthus, you get this prediction that faster, or I'm sorry, that a bigger population should lead to more population growth. Does this make sense? Is this what we observe? That a higher population leads to more population growth? Well, you know, interestingly enough, for a time, yes. Let me show you a picture. Sorry, I forgot to load this up before class. Sorry, wrong one. Damn it. Seeing how slowly I can do this. All right, maybe I did this right now. Okay, so look at this figure here from 8.5. We have the population on the horizontal axis and population growth on the vertical axis. Is it true that a higher population led to faster population growth? Yes, for a while. For a while. So in other words, this prediction of the model, where we take Malthus and we just add in Romer, did work for a while, but that relationship has broken down, right? That relationship has broken down. That for a while, more population led to faster population growth. But now, basically since, when is this? Basically since the early 1900s, 1950, that relationship has broken down, and that we're seeing higher population leads to lower population growth, right? So if I can write this down, if we looked at most of human history, we saw an increase in the population led to an increase in population growth. This was the Malthus and Romer kind of combination that we just talked about. Right? But since the 1950s, we have been experiencing what we'll call the demographic transition. That higher population has actually led to lower population growth. So something has changed here since about the 1950s. What changed? What changed? What has changed the way that population growth is occurring? Well, here we don't really have a great model to explain it, but I think we can make an intuitive argument as to what happened. And the intuitive argument that your book uses, they actually argue that if you think about the relationship between per capita income and L.L, they argue that it looks a lot like this. Okay? That is not a simple linear relationship, but it's actually fairly complicated. That the relationship between population growth and economic growth is a complicated one. Okay? So let me try to explain what they're talking about. The first, you could think about this as kind of the Malthusian world, right? Where higher income led to more population. Actually, I have this graph. I'm sorry, I'm going to redraw this graph. I did it wrong because I shouldn't put it up at the very peak. I should do it more towards the, there's the Malthusian world, right? And the Malthusian world was a world of low technology growth, and most of the world is trapped at subsistence levels of income. Most of the world's trapped at subsistence levels of income. And then you could kind of think about this as stage one in development. Then stage two is the Romer plus Malthus world. Okay, where population still is, or I'm sorry, higher income levels is still increasing population. But notice here that people are getting above subsistence, right? People are getting above subsistence. So incomes are going up, but it's still the case that these higher incomes are driving higher population. And the reason is technology is growing faster than population. So income is rising slowly. So higher incomes are driving up population, but the rate of technology is growing faster than population. So we're still seeing these increases in income. Okay, everybody with me so far? And then we hit a third stage of history, right? And the third stage for history is basically one of what we'll call diminishing marginal returns to population. Right? As we get more and more people, does it still increase income? Yes, but less and less. And what we see is population growth slows to a steady state. And what is that steady state? Close to zero, right? Close to zero. In other words, we're moving to a state in which population growth is getting close to zero. I didn't really draw it particularly well here, but if I went up to redrew this graph, I should be doing it. What? Stop that. I should be doing it more like this, right? The population growth in the long run is really going closer to zero, right? If not absolute zero. What triggered this transitions between these stages? Well, once again, this is very tough to prove. Okay, so I don't make any claim here that there's like some robust proof of this theory. But we can certainly tell a story, a historical story. One is, over time in certain parts of the world, there was definitely an increase in the power of labor, right? As we moved away from feudalism, things like the Black Plague actually contributed to this by raising wages. The Black Plague in England was associated with a peasant revolt, where basically peasants revolted and forced the government to increase wages and free labor to move more freely. All of this led to significant increases in productivity and might have helped us move from Malthus to the Malthus and Romer world, right? Where we began to have some increases in standards of living. Not quickly and not the same in every place of the world, but you could argue that this transition out of the strict Malthusian trap in many ways really was associated with something that was very negative in general, which is a lot of the population dying. Over time, there were other very important changes in institutions that increased property rights and individual rights. Right? And these are things that kicked up off the Industrial Revolution. We've talked about this before, right? This idea that protecting property rights and giving people more of an ability to keep the spoils of their labor significantly increased productivity, significantly increased the incentives for technology. And then the third big thing that these new technologies reduce the importance of land and agriculture in our economy. So if you think about our production function, it reduced X and it increased K, right? So now we have to think about capital as something that isn't just land. So eventually over time, we eliminated X and we replaced it with K in our production function. But just as importantly, this played a very important role, and we'll talk about this more after break, of it significantly reduced the incentives to have larger families. Because when you have an agricultural economy, that creates a lot of incentive to have bigger families, because bigger families mean more people that can work around the farm. What happens is you move to a more technology and ideas-based economy. Well, as we're going to talk about, what that means is you have to invest more money in each child. You have to have fewer children and invest more in them. That completely changes the incentives of how many children you have. So this movement away from an agricultural economy to a more ideas-based economy is really moving from stage, if I can show this up here, from the Malthus and Romer world to the world where there's diminishing marginal returns to population, right? Because now having more people is not nearly as beneficial as it used to be before. So this is really moving from stage 2 to stage 3. Is the reduction in the importance of agriculture. So, you know, as Americans, we may not realize this. If you went back to 1900 in the US, how many Americans were farmers? 85%. 85% of Americans were farmers. Today, 2%, right? That has significantly changed incentives in terms of family size, right? I mean, it's changed everything in our economy. It hasn't just, you know, changed population, but it's meant that a lot more people have been freed from producing food to do other things, right? To do other things. So, you know, what we've seen is that, for instance, from between 1970 and 2010, food productivity rose by 350%. While at the same time, the number of people working in agriculture fell by 10%, right? So we've reduced the number of people, we've increased the amount of production. That is technology and innovation, right? And that has begun to significantly change the relationship between labor and economics. It hasn't happened the same in all of the world, right? Still in sub-Saharan Africa, most people are farmers and most income is spent on food, right? So that is one of the big differences between poor regions, is that poor regions, more people work as farmers and they spend a larger fraction of their income on food. Rich countries, very few people are working as farmers, but of course they're producing so much more that they can spend less money on food, right? I mean, it's just a fundamental digression here between the rich world and the poor world. So yeah, you know, that's kind of how you have to think about, well, I don't know. I think there's other ways of saying this. And like I said, I don't want to say that this is like some sort of clear-cut theory that predicts all of history or explains everything. But you know, it's kind of a general framework that I find somewhat persuasive to think about how this relationship between population and income has changed over time. And you know, it's gradual, right? If you look at this picture, it makes it look like, well, there's like very clear distinctions or whatever. But you know, really, it's been very gradual, right? That the nature of our economics has moved away from a Malthusian world to kind of like Malthus light to today, something where we really have an anti-Malthusian world, right? And that to some extent, having more people is a good thing. And certainly, for individuals, there's individual families, there's much less incentive to have bigger families, right? Because of the nature of the way that that work has changed. And so that's where we'll pick up after break. Let's take maybe a 10-minute break, and then I want to actually talk about what's been happening, the fertility rates across the world, and how we have to think about modern population growth. Okay, so let's meet back here at 10:10. All right, everyone. So let's actually look at some data here. Right, some data on what's been happening to fertility rates and population growth rates across the globe. Okay, so first off, here's looking at fertility rates in India and Nigeria, okay? So table 4.1 is demographic data for India. Okay, so fertility is the number of live births per woman, right? So you can see that in India, in 1955, there was on average about 6 live births per woman, right? That's down to 2.73 in 2005. Actually, if we had more recent data, you see that this is now very close to 2. So to give you some idea, to keep population constant, you need a fertility rate of about 2.1, which makes sense, right? A little bit over 2% because, and it's a little bit over 2 because a fertility rate of 2 means you're just replacing, right? 2 adults, right? Have 2 kids, that's replacement. Given that some kids die early, you need a fertility rate a little bit higher than that, about 2.1 is what the replacement rate of fertility is. So India has fallen quite a bit. In other parts of the world, less. You look at Nigeria in 1955 had a fertility rate of close to 7. And while that's fallen, it hasn't fallen nearly enough, right? It's still well above replacement rates. And so if you look over here to the right, you see the net reproduction rate. This is basically the population growth rate. And the population growth rate in India has fallen, quite significantly. But, in Nigeria, it hasn't changed that much, but in part because infant mortality still tends to be very high. If you look here in the US, fertility rates in the US have gone essentially to replacement rates. So if it wasn't for if it wasn't for immigration, population growth in the US has essentially gone to 0. And in fact, if we could see more recent data, we'd actually see that we have fallen below replacement rates. So interestingly enough, the 2008 global financial crisis significantly reduced fertility rates, right? So the recession reduced population rates, and then the COVID has also significantly reduced population growth rates. And so we are now below replacement, meaning that if it wasn't for immigration, our population would be shrinking. Given that immigration rates have been falling, we are probably very close to being, below replacement rates. In other words, having a shrinking population in the US. What about the globe? Here's looking at the global population growth rate. And you can see here, this is looking both now and into the future. But, today the global population growth rate is a little bit less than 1% a year. But you can see the UN projections in which this will be getting closer to 0 over time, right? Closer to 0 over time. So obviously these projections are pretty far out in the future, right? We have to take these with a big grain of salt. But there's no indication. Every indication is that population growth across the world is going to continue to fall. And so as I think I talked about earlier, this is often known as the demographic dividend. The demographic dividend. Where higher incomes reduce population growth, the opposite of that predicted by Malthus. Today, half of the world lives in a country in which they have negative population growth. For those of you who follow Europe, European politics, European history, this is a really important issue in Europe. What in the world do we do to try to have more people, right? In Germany, they actually are trying to incentivize German couples having more babies, right? In Germany, you actually get a cash payment for every baby that you have. Right? Many countries are talking about free healthcare, or I'm sorry, free childcare, right, from birth, as a way to try to incentivize couples having more children, right? And why has this happened? Why is this so much different? Well, as I alluded to before break, it really has to do with the incentives to have a child. The incentives to have children have changed. Right? The incentive to children have changed, to having children have changed. So, think about this. This is a very crude way of saying it, but there's a quantity versus quality trade-off. There's a quantity to quality trade-off. In the old days, the emphasis was toward having more children because this was the Malthusian world. More labor. Labor was unskilled. So this means that child labor was actually a fairly valuable thing. How is this different today? Well, I can speak from personal experience. Kids today don't do me any good in terms of increasing my income. They're doing nothing in terms of increasing my standard of living. Basically, in modern economy, we have higher opportunity cost of children, right? Now, instead of getting the kids to work for me, what do I have to do? I have to send in the cello lessons and gymnastic lessons and soccer lessons and make sure that they're having, this high quality experience. Why? Well, because we know that labor now is not really unskilled. We have to invest in human capital. So children today are much, much more human capital intensive than children of bygone eras. We have to spend a lot more on them. So what's the incentive today? To have fewer children and spend more on each one, as opposed to having a lot of children but spending less on each one, right? And so that's basically the move from a ideas economy, right, from an agricultural economy. And so the transition from an agricultural economy to an ideas economy has completely changed the incentives of how many children we have. And so, when you recognize this really kind of puts into some perspective why many ideas that are public policies that have been implemented to change population growth rates rarely work. When I, in the 80s and 90s, and also when I lived in Africa, there were a lot of these kind of cash for condoms programs. And what that means was that a lot of development policy was put into basically making condoms freely available with the idea that most people don't want to have as many children as they have. How did these cash for condom programs work? Not very well. Why? Because most births are wanted. Not all, but most births are desired. So when I showed you that data of, the fertility rate in Nigeria being 7, were Nigerian women having 7 children on average because they just make a lot of accidents? No, they were desired births, right? They were desired births. And so just giving more condoms does not necessarily reduce the incentive to have more children. And so as a result, they didn't really work very well. Right, here's one study that kind of looks at total fertility versus what's called desired fertility. And desired fertility is really estimating how many children that women want to have. And you'll notice here that yes, total fertility is above desired fertility. There are accidents, but in general, countries that have high total fertility also have high desired fertility, right? So there aren't countries that are way up here in the top left corner that have really high total fertility, but really low desired fertility. In general, the biggest determinant of fertility is how many children women want to have. And so just kind of going in and dumping a lot of condoms on countries with high fertility is not going to change the basic incentive that people want to have kids, right? This is looking, this is just looking at one of the consequences of our lower population growth rates that we've talked about a few times here in this class, is that the global population is getting older, right? The global population is getting much older. In 2020, for the first time, the median human will be older than 30 years old. And so if you can see this graph, let's squeeze this in here a little bit more. This is looking at the number of people on the horizontal axis and then the median, the average year. And so you can see here that as the number of people have gone up, right, we're getting older, right? This is being pushed up into the right, right? Up into the right, which means that we're having more people, but also older people, right? And so, you can see that the rate of the increase in the number of people is definitely slowing, and that these curves are getting closer together, right? These curves are getting closer together. And so in 2020, the average person is 30 something, and that is just going to continue to go up, right? Some countries, this is going up at alarming rates. To pick a couple of countries where it's going up at alarming rates, Japan, right? Japan is a rapidly aging country, in large part because they have very low fertility rates, and then also because Japanese tend to be very long-lived people. And so what this is doing is rapidly increasing the age of the Japanese population. Likewise, China have rapidly aging population, in part because of their one-child policy, which restricted population growth and has meant that the population is aging fairly radically. This is this is kind of tongue-in-cheek, okay? So don't take this seriously. It's a bit of a joke. But this is from The Economist, and it says, the end of history, the year at which the population of a country will disappear at its current reproduction rates. So, listen, this is kind of predicting that if population growth just stays the same today forever, when will Hong Kong disappear? And, we're looking at the year, about 2,900, right? You look down here, China, like the year 3,300, right? So Chinese people only have another 1,200 years or so. You know, obviously that's, we would not expect population growth rates to stay the same for 1,200 years. But it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about this, right? Is that at current population growth rates, populations are shrinking. Now, it would take a long time for populations to shrink down to zero. But, you know, many countries are having to deal with the consequences of having shrinking populations, because this influences a lot of things. It influences their productivity, right? It influences how many people are working versus how many people are retired. It influences their social safety nets, right? We're seeing this in the US as we have an older population. That's also a population that needs more health care, that needs more social security, right? These have big influences on a lot of different kind of policies. Right. Let's talk just a little bit, because we have a couple of minutes to do so, just a minute or two about China's one-child policy. Okay, and so China's one-child policy which was adopted in the 1950s, was very strict, and for the most part, not completely, there were exceptions, and in different parts of the country, there were more exceptions available than other parts of the country. So, you know, when we talk about China's one-child policy, it is very clear to say there wasn't really one one-child policy, right? China actually, because of the way that its government is set up, there's actually quite a bit of variation between different regions when it comes to implementing both what the policy is, but how strictly it was implemented. But in general, this was a significant fall in fertility, from about 6 live births per woman to about 1.76 in the 1990s. And I think today, this fertility rate has fallen to about 1.5, which is well below replacement rates, well below replacement rates. This was removed in, shoot, does anybody know? I want to say 2017. I think that was the year. Let me put a little question mark there. I can't remember the exact date that this was officially removed. And once again, it kind of was staged different in different parts of China, right? So for instance, in the early 2010s, you could go to Hong Kong and have a baby. And in fact, many rich Chinese people did exactly that, right? Or you could go abroad and have a baby. So there were options for getting around this, but it was kind of officially removed in 2017. Any guesses at when China removed the one-child policy, what impact did that have on their fertility rates? 0, right? 0. In fact, sorry. China today is now essentially at the fertility of Taiwan, which never had the policy. And so basically, removing the policy did not really create much more incentive for Chinese people to have more children. Why? Because what is the most powerful incentive to have less children? Getting richer, right? I mean, getting richer is a very powerful incentive to have less children. And in part, it goes to that opportunity cost of having kids. And what are the biggest opportunity costs? Well, yes, it is the cello lessons and the soccer lessons, but it is also giving up work. Particularly women, because women have traditionally done most of the childcare. And so as women have entered the labor force, you have to think about that opportunity cost of having a kid is now it's all that income that the woman forgoes if she stays at home and has a kid. And so what's happened in the meantime, what's happened because of China's one-child policy is that or I should not because of one-child policy, but while the one-child policy was in place, China got a lot richer. And so over time, it hasn't been the policy itself that's been reducing population rates. It's been being richer that has begun to play the most important role in why Chinese population rates have fallen quite significantly, right? The problem with the one-child policy there's a few problems. First off, it wasn't really needed in the sense that China would have seen a significant fall in its fertility without the policy. It wasn't really needed. So if I can just show you some data here. This is looking at the fertility rate across different countries. And so you see the one-child policy was actually in place in China before 1980. They have like the official implementation. But you see that China really significantly reduced its fertility rate, right? Between, during the period of this graph. So the decline in fertility in the US the decline in fertility in China was much stronger, right? Much stronger than any of these other countries. But in the end, they ended up in the same place that Korea did, that never imposed a one-child policy, okay? And so you didn't necessarily have to impose a one-child policy to significantly reduce fertility rates. So what China did is they kind of did by brute force, what simple economics would have done over time. And so you might say, well, what's the big deal? They end up in the right place. Well, no, right? The problem that China now faces is that there's a lot of unintended consequences. There's a lot of unintended consequences as a result of this, such as a rapidly aging population. Because this cutoff was so steep, the Chinese population is aging much more rapidly than it is in a place like the US, where population growth rate has fallen more slowly over time. There's been a lot of cultural impacts, right? For instance, one of the unusual things that exists in China, and you can kind of see it as you just walk around if you're just a kind of a careful observer, is for most children in China, there was only children. And so what that means is that you have children that are essentially growing up with 6 adults. Their 2 parents and their grandparents on either side, right? And so you have a lot of attention, a lot of resources invested in each one of these only children, which, many people have talked about the way that this is changing the Chinese family structure. there's this idea in China. I mean, I think this is a little demeaning, but there's this phenomenon that some people talk about of the little emperors, right? Which is that when there's one child and six adults doting on them all the time, that oftentimes the single children can be kind of, spoiled, I guess, to use a US word. There's also this problem of gender ratio and gender imbalance. So for those of you who are Chinese, you might know this, but so if you just look at the ages of 20 to 29 in China, there are essentially 15 million women missing from that demographic. Why? Because of the one-child policy. There are big cultural reasons in China, if you have one child, to have it a boy, right? And so many people selectively aborted their children, or or other things to make sure that their female children did not survive, so that they had male children. So what this means is that there's not only 15 million missing from this, is that there's 15 million missing from the entire population. That is a lot of missing women, and that is a big gender imbalance. And so this is impacting things like marriage rates. Some economists have shown that it's impacting dowries, that in many parts of China now, it's grooms that pay dowries, not women. Right? Traditionally, it had been the women that paid dowries in traditional Chinese families. That's not the case anymore, because women are more in demand because there's more men than women. And so that's a classic example of supply and demand at work, right? So, and once again, there's a lot of talk about how this is changing people's lives, how this is changing culture and society in ways that, without getting into the details, may not always be so great. And then, of course, there's this whole human rights impact of this, right? With forced abortions, murdering of young children, the jailing of people who had multiple children, right? I mean, there were any number of just horrible human rights abuses justified by this policy. So anyway, I think this is an example where, when we look back at economic policy sometimes has done good, but in some ways it has done more harm than good. And a lot of the development policy of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, which focused so much on population control, I think we can look back now and say that it was really kind of a disaster, right? That it was disaster in terms of the welfare of the people it impacted. But it's a disaster still that's impacting societies today, as we have these weird demographics in some countries that are not conducive for sustained growth. So in conclusion here, because we're running out of time, let me just say, was Malthus right about anything? And the answer is yes. Some of the world very much still looks Malthusian. They are caught in poverty traps. That are heavily agricultural, all the incentives of society are aimed at unskilled labor. There's few incentives to invest in capital or technology. That is a poverty trap. A lot of times poverty traps are organized around this idea that capital is a substitute for labor. And so many societies have organized their institutions around essentially protecting the jobs of the unskilled. So I told you about that coffee shop in Botswana. Why are there so many people sitting around? And what I was told was that in Botswana, if you have a business that is a certain square foot, you also had to have a certain number of people working there. Which is a pretty stupid rule, right? But it is a rule that incentivizes jobs for unskilled labor. But what does that do? That really keeps people poor because it keeps labor very unskilled and creates very little incentives for labor to get more skilled, and as a result, to get higher wages. So it seems counterintuitive. But only when you make labor more productive. And incentivize using less of it. Do wages and jobs rise? Right? And this seems so counterintuitive, right? It does. But only when you make labor more productive and you incentivize using less of it. Well, how do businesses use less labor? They develop more technology and more capital. But that, of course, increases wages, but it increases the productivity of labor. So it makes labor more productive when firms do find a useful use for it. Okay? So, when we talk about this is the poverty trap, right? Well, this is the virtuous circle. By trying to use less labor, you actually can create incentives to use more labor. Why? Because you invest more in capital and technology, where labor is a complement to capital and technology. Okay? So, I do believe there's not a lot of things that are counterintuitive in economics, but I think there's something about this idea that seems very counterintuitive to people, right? Is particularly when you go to poor countries, you just think, well, there's too many people here. They don't need more capital and technology, they just need more jobs. Well, the problem with just creating more jobs is that is a poverty trap, right? You're giving no incentive for people to actually move from an unskilled labor-based economy to a more ideas-based economy, right? And so the only way that you can really get people out of that Malthusian trap is you really got to give incentives for capital and technology to occur. And part of that is by making labor more costly, more costly. So if this seems confusing, once again, think back to the Black Plague, right? The Black Plague might have played a big role in the Industrial Revolution starting in England, because somewhat counterintuitively, by making labor more costly, it changed the incentives of how people do business, right? And so, yeah, that's a costly, that's a counterintuitive idea, right? It's a counterintuitive idea. There's something about Malthus that is very intuitive to us. Right? And in some ways, I find when listening to people talk about population, that they want to believe in Malthus, they have a harder time believing in Romer, right? And so, but I discourage you from thinking that way, because I think the bulk of the evidence suggests that yes, some countries are trapped in a Malthusian world, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? And the good news is more and more countries have escaped that trap. So anyway, all right, there's my lecture, almost right on the bell, a couple minutes over. So everybody good? Any questions about anything? So tomorrow, I can't even remember what we're talking about tomorrow. Let me look really quick here. Tomorrow, okay, this is good. We're talking about natural resources in geography, okay? So there's that, and I think we'll also talk about finance and growth. So you have 2 readings for tomorrow. So, so you have those 2 readings, and then also, of course, you have to do work on your paper. So if any of you want to meet with me this afternoon, just shoot me an email and we can set up a time, okay? If not, I'll see you tomorrow morning. All right, bye everyone. What time would you like to meet this afternoon, Kunyan?
How about the normal afternoon time, like 12:30?
So I have a meeting that really, I think, to be safe, is probably going to take me till 2. So could
All right.
we meet 2 or after that?
Sure.
2 o'clock?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so 2 o'clock, let's just meet here in this room, okay?
All right.
Okay, see you then. Hey, Jordan.
Hey, I just have a comment.
Sure.
So you were talking about when you went to Botswana and how there's a bunch of workers
Mm-hmm.
in the coffee shop. So would advances in technology and specialization of jobs, would that help? Because then you're getting away from the unskilled labor and you're going towards more.
Right. Yeah, no, I think it would. I think it would. So, what happens when you have to hire that many people, is that you have to find something for all of them to do. So, for instance, why would you invest in a big, modern espresso machine when you can have people doing it in a very labor-intensive way? Or, in that place, you didn't even walk up to the counter to buy. You sat down and somebody came to you and said, what kind of coffee do you want? And you told them, and then they brought it to you, right?
It's
So
like a sit-down restaurant.
Right, yeah. So completely changes the incentive for how the place works, right? And so what you need is you need to have incentives for people to invest in that machinery, hire fewer workers, but then what can those fewer workers do? They can go out and do other things, right? Or they have an incentive to go back and spend more time in school or education or develop their human capital, right? But you're essentially, you can't think of it as kicking people out of jobs. You have to think about it as creating free resources, freeing up labor to do other things that are better, right? That's from the macro perspective, that's the much better way of thinking about it.
Not using labor as a substitute.
Exactly, but as a complement, right? And so there's so many more things that people could be doing in Botswana, right? I think I showed you those pictures of women sweeping the streets with brooms, right? And that's just the way things are. It's how do we create employment for these older women? Okay, there's a broom, go sweep the streets. But in the aggregate, that doesn't really make much sense because you have so much labor that's really doing things that are not productive for society.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
All right. See you
All right.
later. Have a good afternoon.
Yeah, you too.